I walked into the family courthouse in downtown Boston, knowing everyone in that room had already decided how my story would end. They thought I was reckless, some thought I was desperate, a few probably thought I had finally lost my mind. My name is Rachel Morgan, and that morning I was representing myself in a divorce case against my former husband, Lucas Harrington. Lucas was not just my ex. He was the CEO of Northshore Freight Group, a logistics company everyone in the city knew. Powerful friends, endless money, and a legal team that looked like they were built to crush people quietly and efficiently. I had none of that. No attorney sitting beside me, no briefcase full of color-coded binders, no whispering assistants passing notes behind me. Just me, a legal pad, and a calm I had practiced for months. As I took my seat, I could feel the judgment in the air, the quiet glances, the unspoken agreement that this would be over quickly. They expected tears. They expected me to sign whatever was put in front of me and disappear back into the life I came from. Lucas certainly did. He did not even try to hide his confidence. He leaned back in his chair, perfectly relaxed, as if this was a meeting he already knew the outcome of. He looked at me the way someone looks at a closed chapter, finished, forgotten. What no one in that courtroom understood was this: I did not walk in unprepared. I walked in knowing exactly where every secret was buried. For years, I listened when people thought I was not paying attention. I watched patterns they assumed I was too simple to notice. I learned silence when speaking would have been dangerous. And now, standing in that courtroom, I was done being quiet. This was not the day I lost everything. This was the day the truth finally walked into the room with me. To understand why everyone underestimated me, you have to understand the version of Rachel Morgan they believed in. In their minds, I was simple, predictable, easy to dismiss. Before Lucas Harrington entered my life, I worked long shifts at a small neighborhood cafe. I memorized orders. I smiled through exhaustion. I counted tips at the end of the night and hoped they would stretch far enough. When Lucas and I married, that story disappeared. I became his wife. Not his partner, not his equal, just the woman who stayed home and made his life easier. I handled the house, the schedules, the social obligations that made him look polished and respectable. I remembered birthdays, organized charity dinners, and smiled at people who never learned my name. To the outside world, that looked like comfort. What they did not see was control. Lucas managed every dollar. I did not have access to our accounts. If I needed money, I asked. If I questioned a charge, I was told not to worry about things I did not understand. At first, I believed him. He spoke with confidence. Numbers came easily to him. I told myself this was how marriages worked, when one person was successful and the other was not. But over time, the boundaries tightened. My phone calls were questioned. My friendships faded. Invitations stopped coming. Somewhere along the way, my world shrank so quietly I barely noticed it happening. When the divorce began, Lucas made sure the narrative stayed intact. He told people I was emotional, unstable, dependent. His lawyer described me as financially inexperienced, someone who would be overwhelmed by complex information, someone who needed to be protected from herself. And the worst part was this: I helped them believe it. I kept my head down, I spoke softly, I let them mistake my silence for confusion. Because while they were busy defining me by who I used to be, they never asked who I had become. They never asked what happens when a woman spends years being ignored. They never considered that the person who lives inside the system often understands it better than the one who built it. By the time I stood alone in that courtroom, I knew exactly how they saw me, and I knew exactly how wrong they were. Lucas Harrington had mastered the art of looking untouchable. He wore confidence the way some men wear tailored suits, effortlessly, without question. He walked into rooms assuming he belonged there, and most of the time, people agreed. As the CEO of Northshore Freight Group, Lucas was known as a closer. He made deals happen. He knew how to move money, shift assets, and make problems disappear before they became public. That reputation followed him into the courtroom. When Lucas sat down at the defense table, it was clear he believed this was just another negotiation, one he expected to win. His posture was relaxed, his expression calm, almost bored. Beside him sat his attorney, Victor Hale. Victor was not loud. He did not need to be. He had a reputation for precision and pressure. He spoke rarely, but when he did, people listened. He was known for forcing settlements without ever raising his voice. Together, they looked like a machine designed for one purpose: control. Lucas glanced at me once, briefly, the way someone checks the time. There was no anger in his eyes, no fear, just dismissal. To him, I was a problem that lingered longer than expected. I knew his habits well. I had watched him in meetings, at dinners, at charity events. He listened just long enough to decide whether someone mattered. And that morning, he had already decided I did not. Lucas believed the story he had built around himself, that success was proof of intelligence, that wealth meant credibility, that the law was another tool he knew how to use. He assumed my lack of representation meant weakness. He assumed silence meant ignorance. What he failed to consider was this: men like Lucas spend their lives speaking. They rarely practice listening. And I had spent years doing exactly that. Every late-night call, every rushed explanation, every moment he thought I was too distracted to notice, I remembered them all. As the judge prepared to begin, Lucas leaned back in his chair, certain the balance of power was firmly on his side. He had no idea the ground beneath him was already shifting. While Lucas was busy building his image, I was building something quieter. At night, when the house was finally still, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open and the lights dimmed low. I taught myself how to read bank statements, how to follow transfers, how to understand the language hidden inside spreadsheets. I did not do this because I wanted control. I did it because I wanted clarity. Lucas assumed I was uninterested in his work. He talked freely around me. He took calls at the dinner table. He complained about partners, regulators, and people he thought were incompetent. He never lowered his voice. I learned patterns the way other people learned routines. Which accounts were mentioned only in passing, which transactions appeared at the end of the quarter, which names came up only when he was stressed. I did not confront him. I did not ask questions that would raise suspicion. I listened. When he synced his devices to the family cloud account for convenience, I noticed. When files appeared in folders I had never seen before, I noticed that too. I began saving copies, not stealing, not hacking, just backing up what already existed in shared space. Emails, statements, internal summaries that were never meant to leave his screen. I kept everything simple: dates, amounts, repetition. No theories, no assumptions, just fact. There were nights I wanted to stop, nights I told myself I was overthinking, that nothing I found would matter anyway. But then I would remember how easily my access to money had been cut off, how quickly my voice had been dismissed once I became inconvenient. That was when I understood something important. Preparation is not about revenge, it's about survival. By the time Lucas filed for divorce, I had months of information quietly organized. Nothing dramatic, nothing flashy, just a clear map of where the truth lived. So when I walked into that courtroom alone, I was not guessing. I was confirming. They thought I came empty-handed because they couldn't see what I was carrying. They did not realize the quiet woman they ignored had been paying attention the entire time. And attention, when combined with patience, is far more dangerous than anger. The courtroom felt different once the hearing began. At first, everything followed the expected rhythm: formal introductions, polite language, carefully measured confidence from the defense. Victor Hale spoke smoothly, laying out a familiar narrative: a successful executive, a short-lived marriage, a reasonable offer extended and refused. Lucas barely looked at me as Victor talked. He already knew this version of the story by heart. When it was my turn to question him, I kept my voice steady and my words simple. I did not accuse, I did not dramatize, I asked questions. I mentioned a holding account Victor had not referenced, an investment vehicle Lucas had dismissed as insignificant during our marriage. The reaction was immediate. Victor paused just for a second, but the hesitation was there. I asked him how often that account was used. I asked whether it appeared on the standard disclosure list provided during divorce proceedings. Daniel cleared his throat. He said it was operational. He said it was not relevant to marital assets. I asked whether funds ever moved from that account into external investment vehicles. The room went still. Victor objected, claiming the question was outside the scope. The judge allowed it. Daniel's confidence faded. He explained that some transfers were routine and authorized. He insisted nothing improper had occurred. I thanked him and then asked one final question. I asked whether any transfers had occurred in the 90 days before Lucas filed. Daniel looked at Lucas before answering. That was when everything changed. The judge noticed, Victor noticed, and Lucas noticed that everyone noticed. Daniel answered carefully, admitting several transfers had occurred shortly before the filing. I did not accuse him of doing wrong. I simply stated that I would be presenting documentation that aligned with his testimony. Daniel stepped down, his earlier ease replaced with visible tension. As he left the stand, I saw it clearly. This was no longer about a divorce settlement. This was about whether the truth would stay buried. And judging by the way Lucas avoided my eyes, I knew it would not. That was when Lucas decided to change tactics. Victor stood and addressed the court with a tone that sounded almost concerned. He said this case was becoming emotional. He suggested the court consider my credibility before weighing complex financial claims. Then he introduced my medical history. He spoke about a period years earlier when I sought help for anxiety and grief. He used words like treatment and evaluation. He implied instability without saying it directly. Lucas watched me closely, waiting for a reaction. I did not give him one. I had spent years learning how silence could be twisted against you. This time, I would not let it. When it was my turn to respond, I stood slowly. I did not rush. I did not defend myself emotionally. I told the truth. I explained that I sought help during a time of loss, that I did what responsible adults do when they feel overwhelmed. That treatment did not make me unreliable. It made me honest about my limits. I looked at the judge and said something simple. Seeking help does not disqualify a person from telling the truth. Victor pressed harder. He suggested I had imagined threats, that I misunderstood conversations, that stress had distorted my memory. I listened without interrupting. Then I said the sentence Lucas did not expect. I said I was medicated because I was being controlled. The room shifted again. I explained that confusion does not come from weakness alone. It often comes from being told repeatedly that your reality is wrong, from having your access removed, from being isolated and corrected until you stop trusting your own judgment. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I stated facts. And then I said this. I am not asking the court to believe me because I am hurt. I am asking the court to believe me because I brought proof. Lucas stopped smiling, because for the first time, the story that protected him was starting to fall apart, and he knew exactly what was coming next. I reached into my bag slowly, making sure every movement was deliberate. I did not want this moment to feel dramatic. I wanted it to feel undeniable. I explained that Massachusetts is a one-party consent state, that I was legally allowed to record conversations I was part of, that I had done so not out of spite, but out of fear. Victor objected immediately. He questioned relevance. He questioned intent. The judge allowed it. I held up a small audio device. Nothing impressive, no labels, just a record of time. I told the court these recordings captured conversations between Lucas and me during the final years of our marriage, conversations where money was discussed, where control was discussed, where consequences were explained very clearly. The first recording played. Lucas's voice filled the room, calm, certain, dismissive. He said no one would believe me. He said I did not understand the finances. He said if I pushed too hard, I would lose access to everything. There was no yelling, no threats shouted in anger. That was what made it worse. It was control spoken as fact. The second recording played. Lucas explained how assets could be moved temporarily, how nothing needed to appear permanent, how timing mattered more than truth. Victor stared at the table. Lucas stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. By the time the third recording ended, the courtroom was completely silent. No whispers, no movement. Even the judge had stopped writing. I turned off the device and sat back down. I did not look at Lucas. I did not need to, because power does not disappear loudly. It disappears when everyone hears it spoken out loud for the first time. And in that moment, Lucas Harrington was no longer in control of the story. The truth is, after the recordings ended, nothing moved for several seconds. The judge looked down at the evidence, then at Lucas, then back at me. This was no longer about who felt wronged. It was about accountability. Victor requested a brief pause. His voice was controlled, but the certainty he had entered with was gone. The court denied the request and ordered the hearing to continue. The judge asked direct questions about timing, about disclosure, about whether all assets connected to Northshore Freight Group had been properly reported. Lucas answered carefully at first, short responses, limited explanations. Then the questions became narrower, the answers became slower. The court ordered a temporary review of financial disclosures and requested immediate documentation related to the transfers mentioned during testimony. Accounts were flagged. Access was restricted. Nothing dramatic happened in that moment. No shouting, no raised voices, just procedure. And procedure is often more frightening than confrontation. Lucas finally looked at me again, not with anger, not with confidence, with disbelief. He had believed this room would protect him, that his position would outweigh my words, that money would speak louder than truth. But once facts enter the record, belief no longer matters. The judge made it clear that further investigation would follow, that incomplete disclosures carry consequences, that credibility had shifted. When the session adjourned for the day, Lucas did not stand immediately. Victor leaned toward him, speaking quietly. The tone was no longer instructive, it was urgent. As I gathered my papers, I felt something unexpected. Not victory, relief. Because for the first time since the divorce began, I was no longer defending myself. The truth was doing that work for me. When the judge asked me what I was seeking, the room expected a number. They expected me to name a percentage, half the assets, a payout, something that could be negotiated and reduced. That was never my goal. I stood and explained that I was not asking for punishment. I was asking for balance. I told the court that money used to hide truth is not wealth, it is leverage. And leverage only works when no one is willing to challenge it. I asked for full transparency for every account tied to Lucas Harrington, for every asset moved without disclosure to be considered part of the marital estate. I asked for temporary control over shared assets until the review was complete, not to take anything away, but to prevent anything else from disappearing. The judge listened carefully. I explained that I did not want to win by watching someone fall. I wanted to walk away knowing the truth had been acknowledged, and that no one else would be quietly erased the way I had been. This was not about revenge, it was about ending the pattern. I told the court that when one person controls the narrative long enough, they start believing it cannot be challenged, and that belief is dangerous. What I asked for was simple, that the law do what it was designed to do: slow down power, examine facts, protect the person who is never meant to be heard. When I sat back down, the room was quiet again, not tense, focused, and for the first time, I felt something settle in my chest. I had said everything I needed to say. The rest was no longer up to me. When I walked out of the courthouse that afternoon, the city looked the same. Cars moved, people rushed past, life continued as if nothing monumental had just happened inside those walls. But for me, everything had shifted. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel powerful. What I felt was lighter. For months, my life had revolved around defending my reality, proving I was not imagining things, explaining myself to people who had already made their minds up. That burden was gone. The legal process did not end that day. Investigations take time. Paperwork stretches on. Consequences unfold slowly. But something far more important had already happened. My voice had entered the record. I went back to a smaller apartment. I bought my own groceries. I set up a checking account in my own name for the first time in years. None of it was glamorous, but every choice was mine. I relearned how to trust my instincts, how to sit with silence without fear, how to make plans that did not depend on someone else's permission. People asked me if it was hard to start over. The truth is, starting over was easier than staying invisible. What took time was forgiving myself for how long I stayed quiet. I was not weak for surviving. I was strong for preparing. And as the days passed, I realized something quietly powerful. I was no longer defined by the marriage I escaped. I was defined by the clarity I earned. People often say that power is loud. They imagine it as shouting, as dominance, as someone always speaking first and last. That is not the kind of power that changed my life. The power that mattered was quieter. It was patience. It was observation. It was choosing to understand instead of reacting. It was knowing when to stay silent and when to finally speak. Lucas Harrington believed strength meant control. He believed money could replace accountability. He believed the story he told about me would survive forever if he repeated it often enough. He was wrong, not because I fought harder than him, but because I prepared longer. If there is one thing I want you to take from my story, it is this: never assume the quiet person knows nothing. Never mistake compliance for agreement, and never believe that truth disappears just because it's ignored. Sometimes justice does not arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives with records, with patience, with the courage to wait for the right moment. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever been underestimated or made to feel invisible, you are not alone. Your clarity matters, your memory matters, and your voice matters even if it takes time to be heard. If you found value in this story, please like the video. It helps more people find stories like this one. Share it with someone who might need the reminder. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been judged for being quiet? Subscribe to The Art of Revenge for more real stories about truth, resilience, and the kind of justice that does not need to shout. Sometimes the most powerful move is simply refusing to disappear.